So we've been going through this series called Bad Ideas. And in this series, it's just a look at some ideas or beliefs, maybe even some doctrines that we might hold to, that we think are right and true and appropriate and good. And yet what we see is, find that as we live out our lives, we can be a little bit off. We can get a little bit off track from what God would want or what God would say to us. And that's really what's most important. It's not so much how we grew up. It's not so much what everybody else is saying. It's not even so much what we've maybe developed as certain commitments and beliefs within us, if we're off course from what God would say. And so we're just challenging some thoughts and some ideas and looking at some things. And I want to get into it again, but I've had fun with this each week with some, and I found some more pictures for you today, some bad ideas, and this is the inventions edition. So these are some inventions that are actually available for purchase right now. If you're, maybe you think some of these are a great idea, but so these are some inventions that people have come up with that are for sale if you'd like to buy some, and we'll take a look at a couple of them. So I think, what's the first one up there? There you go, the walking sleeping bag. That's a walking sleeping bag. And, middle of the night, nature calls, that's not a bad idea. And you can just get right up and go on out. How about the next one?
Doesn't have a zipper.
Yeah, right, it's missing one of the zipper. Here you go, here's a face keeper cleaner or whatever. So if you're really getting crazy with your noodles that way, that'll help keep the rest of the face clean. See, what else we got? Oh, the hander pants. Hey, keeps them from getting sweaty or chapped. You got the hander pants. And you just put those bad boys on, and you are, I'm telling you, if you think I'm a liar, check out Amazon. You can buy them today. Okay. What else we got? Oh, there you go. The handy remote control. If you're always losing the remote control to the television or the radio or whatever, boom, you just got it wherever you're going, and you'll never lose it again. Let's see, I think this is the last one. There you go, the baby mop. The baby mop, you just dress them up, you let them crawl all around, cleans your house, and they get to play. I mean, now that's practical. That's a great idea right there. That's a good one. Okay. So maybe you're starting to get the idea. Once in a while, we have an idea that seems good, but maybe it's actually a little bit off under a little closer review. And that's what we're talking about. That's what we're looking for. Is where do these ideas sometimes get off? And so today, for your consideration, I want to offer up to you what I'm calling the doctrine of courage. Which, however, and we'll, like we've looked at each one of these, it's not so much that courage is wrong. And we'll mention that here in a minute. But sometimes courage just goes the wrong way. And these other things, sometimes they just get off base or they're out of balance. This particular doctrine of courage has a tendency to say, I can handle life all by myself. And that's the wrong kind of courage that we want to have. Before we look at this, I do want to set the stage. I just want to say that I'm not saying, don't be courageous. And there we go with another double negative. Let me say that better. We want to be courageous. With God's help and with God's guidance, we need to be bold. There are times, and Michael and I have talked a little bit about some of the political corruption and the problems even in Kenya that they seem to be fighting nonstop, and how they have to go to war even for the right things, for the kids, and for some of the things we do. So there's sometimes we need to be bold. We need to be courageous. Not too long ago, we did a whole series called Risk. And we talked about times when God calls us out. He calls us to step up in faith and in courage to take certain risks. Without risk, we don't take new land and new territory. Without risk, we don't introduce people to Jesus. You'll never introduce somebody to Jesus without taking a risk and without being a little bit bold and without a little bit of courage. Because we live in a foreign land. We're aliens in a place that's not our home. And so to talk about Jesus to somebody, we have to have some risk and some courage involved. Without risk, we don't bring up difficult conversations. How many husbands and wives give each other the silent treatment instead of being courageous in bringing in something that needs to be talked about? Well, all kinds of things. Without risk, we don't explore new opportunities and try new things. So there are times when we want to be courageous. The Bible tells us to be courageous. 2 Timothy 1 and 7 says, for God gave us a spirit, not of fear, but of power and of love and of self-control. 1 Corinthians 16:13 says, be watchful, stand firm in the faith. I like this. Act like men, Bible says. Now, maybe that's a little more specific to the men than the women. I don't think it's saying to the women act like men. But you get a sense there, right? We get an understanding of he's saying, there are times when we stand up, we're responsible, we do what's necessary, we act like men, be strong, it says. Psalms 31:24, be strong and let your heart take courage, all of you who wait on the Lord. And so each of these is saying we want to be courageous. We want to stand up. We don't want to be afraid. But what we've been looking at in every bad idea, what we notice is, what we realize is, there's often a good quality, a very important, God-honoring quality that has just been taken too far or gone a little askew. It's like our personalities. Every one of us has a personality, and every personality has certain strengths and certain weaknesses. And what we find out oftentimes is our weaknesses are exposed when our strengths just go too far. So for example, maybe somebody's very fun-loving and adventurous, but at the same time, that kind of person has to be careful that they're not undisciplined or they might lack follow-through. Or maybe you're a take-charge type that pushes ahead, gets things done. How we all need those kinds of people to move us into areas of our life. But at the same time, if they're not careful, they can become bossy or manipulative and run over other people. Some people are analytical. They're great thinkers. Don't you love somebody with a great mind and you just see the wheels spinning and they just say things that just help you to look at something brand new. But at the same time, that kind of person, if not careful, can become haughty or proud. Or they think they're always right and they're the only ones that are right. And so every one of us has certain personality traits that are great strengths within us. But if we're not careful, they go too far. And so when I say that there's a bad idea, or it's a bad idea to be courageous, what we want to recognize is that courage is good, but we also realize that we don't want to be courageous in such a way that we become overconfident. And that we become too confident only in ourselves. You see, courage goes awry when we live our lives thinking that we can handle life all by ourselves, and that when we do, things can tend to go really bad. When I'm on the I'll make it on my own plan, when I'm on that system or that approach of life that just says, I know what I'm doing, I can take it from here, and we lack humility before God, we lack humility in our lives that says, I'm still growing, I'm still learning. When we lack the humility that doesn't allow us to continue to learn and grow, then our life starts to go the wrong way. You know, it's interesting that, and I think we need to think about this a little bit, because I believe that we have a culture that says you can be anything you want to be. We have a culture that says you can do anything you want to do. And there's a certain ring of truth even in that. We want to do well. We want to achieve our goals. But we do have a culture that says if you work hard enough, if you are motivated enough, if you are a self-starter, if you're courageous, if you would take risks, then you can achieve any goal. And the problem is that we start walking through our life, pressing ahead into things we want to do, and we learn very quickly that if anybody's going to do it, I have to do it. And we start to live out of this place within us that says, I need to be responsible for myself. I need to do everything that I have set out to do. And we start living our lives in such a way that I'm in charge. I'm going to do it my way. I'm going to live my own life. And this I'll make it on my own mentality can lead to pride. It can lead to isolation, divisiveness, rudeness, selfishness. And we forget that we need help to get through this life. I was talking with a friend just days ago, and he was sharing with me that for a little while he thought he was doing better. He was kind of standing on his own 2 feet again. He was taking care of a couple issues in his life. And as soon as he started doing better, he thought, okay, I'm going to take my life back. I'm going to take over again. I've got it from here. He left the church. He left his walk with God. And he went right back into his old habits. And by the time he found the bottom of his rope, or the end of his rope, he'd lost his freedom. He'd lost his family. He'd lost his job. And he himself said he was truly lost. But the good news is he began seeking God again. He began asking God for help again. He began looking for God's direction in his life again. And as soon as he did that, God started helping him put the pieces back together. God started to help restore what had been lost. And he was just calling to say, hey, Pastor, I want you to let you know, I was lost for a little while, but God's bringing me back. I want to look at a story this morning and learn some things from it out of Numbers chapter 20, verses 1 through 13. It's Moses, and Moses, as you remember, is leading the Israelites through the wilderness onto the promised land. And there's times where Moses was very close with God and listening to God and doing exactly what God told him to do. Then there's other times when Moses thought, okay, I'm going to have to take this, I'll just take care of this myself and do it my way. And we come to a story that's one of those times. God tells Moses to do something, and Moses kind of decides to do it his own way. And he acts out of frustration and bitterness and struggle, and it doesn't go so well. And there's something for us to learn here, I think. So Numbers chapter 20, verses 1 through 13, it's in the first month, the whole Israelite community arrived at the desert of Kin, and they stayed at Kadesh, where Miriam died and was buried. You know, Miriam was Moses' wife, and it's maybe interesting to note, perhaps he was grieving a bit. Now there was no water for the community. And the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, if only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there's no water to drink. Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance to the tent of meetings and fell face down. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord said to Moses, take your staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. And you will bring water out of the rock, enough for the whole community, so that they and their livestock can drink. So Moses took his staff from the presence of the Lord, just as he commanded him. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock? Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of Israel, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. These were the waters of Meribah, where the Israelites quarreled with the Lord, and where he was proved holy among them. So as we think about this story, I want to try to draw out three ideas. So we recognize that Moses kind of had a little bit of trouble with the Israelites. And he had this trouble at different times, and his frustration was growing. How'd you like to have 2 million children to take care of? Because that's kind of the way they acted. And he's struggling and trying to lead them on to the promised land. And they've been out in the wilderness for a long time now. And of course, they have this issue of being thirsty, and they're complaining. And they're complaining so much that why don't you just let us die back in Egypt? At least there was water there. And so they go in and talk to God, and what should we do? And God gives them instructions, and you can see how it went wrong. When I try to handle things myself, I think the first thing I tend to do is I begin to mismanage people. As we think about it, what Moses kind of did here, in his frustration with the folks, with his frustration with what was going on, with their complaining, their quarreling, their arguing, their wanting, and all that, finally he reaches the end of his rope. He's so frustrated that he takes matters into his own hands. And as you look through this, as we think back through this story, we recognize that God was providing this great blessing for the people and giving them water, but Moses turned it into an opportunity to chew them out. God intended a blessing. God was just waiting for them to seek him and ask for his help and his guidance and his provision. And when they do, God in his graciousness and in his love wants to provide what they needed and give them the water. Enough for everyone, enough for all their livestock, all that they would need. He was ready to supply their every need. But what God was doing as a blessing and a kindness to the people, Moses turned it into an opportunity to chew them out. Moses turned it into a chance to kind of give them a piece of his mind. And so Moses, he says, listen here, you rebels. He belts it out to them, and he gives them one upside the head with his frustration with them. And he thinks he's standing as God's man and God's voice piece, but he takes God's blessing and he tramples all over it. God merely wanted his people to trust him and learn how to come to him and call upon him for their daily needs. And when they do, in a loving, gracious provision, God takes care of them. And he does so, or at least he wants to, in a very miraculous way. He says, Moses, just speak to the rock. Water will come out. I mean, what a moment. Well, what an incredible opportunity. The power of God was revealed once again in their midst. God was setting it up and showing them, hey, when you trust me, when you follow me, when you listen to me, when you do what I say, God wanted to demonstrate he was still with them. He still wanted to take care of them. He still loved them. He was still at work in their midst. And Moses took all that away. Moses took all that privilege, all that miracle away, and he did not trust in God, and instead used this as an opportunity to lecture the people. And he launches with this bad attitude, his tirade of anger, his contempt and his bitterness. He really socks it to him. Have you ever mismanaged people in your life? Husbands and wives? Have you ever mismanaged each other? Speaking out of bitterness and anger instead of out of the presence of the Lord? How about parents and children? Ever mismanaged your relationship with each other? Because you never. I know, that's good. Maybe there's bosses and leaders in the room. Have you ever mismanaged the people that you are leading and guiding? What about neighbors or the community that you're a part of? Have you ever mismanaged the people in your life because there was a little bit more you and a little less God than there should have been? Hey, it happens even in the church, doesn't it? James 1:19 says, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. And it's kind of like it's almost like the Bible's given us its own highlight. That seems rather important. It says, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. How it's so much easier to become quick to speak, quick to get angry, and slow to listen. Because we mismanage people when we're not operating in the presence of the Lord. When we start thinking, I can do this by myself, I've got everything under control, I know how to handle my own life, I don't need God, I don't need people telling me how to live, I don't need anybody speaking into my life, I don't need the Word of God pouring into me, but instead I'll just figure it out as I go. One of the things that I find is I begin mismanaging other people. The second thing I think that happens, and this is kind of interesting to me, and let me preface this by saying this is not necessarily what this text is teaching. It's just almost a living analogy, I think. But I think when when I try to handle things myself, I tend to work twice as hard and get half the result. God told Moses that all he should do is speak to the rock and the water would come out. But Moses, in his anger, takes matters into his own hands. And not only does he give the scolding to the people, but it says then he beat the rock twice. He hit it twice. He'd done this miracle before, earlier in this journey, and that time he only hit it once. This time he hit it twice. And I wonder if it didn't work the first time, and he had to do it again, and it finally worked. And then the water did come out. He takes the focus off of God. He dishonors God. He says, I'll have to do this for you, God. I'm going to take over for you, God. I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to show what I need to do. And he even says that, hey, do we have to show you and prove to you that you need to obey God? God says, just show the people me. Just show them who I am. Show them what I want to do. And Moses says, do we have to do this? He takes God completely. Some people think he's talking about Moses. Moses is talking about himself and God, and when he says the word we. And he's talking about him and God. I kind of wonder if he isn't talking about him and Aaron or him and the other leaders. Hey, okay, church, listen up. I'm tired of you. I'm tired of your bellyache and stuff. And we as your leaders, do we have to do everything for you and take care of everything for you? And he kind of steps in and takes over that way. And he takes all the focus off of God. And it just seems to speak of an interesting principle here that says, without God, you work twice as hard and get less result. God just said, speak, Moses. But instead, he starts beating on that rock until he got what he wanted. And how many of us are on that plan? If there's a problem in my life, I'm not going to pray about it. I'm just going to go to work on it. If there's some issue, if I need to learn something, well, I'm just going to, dive in. I don't ask God to guide me and show me. I don't listen for his voice in my life. And it's easy to be running out into life, taking care of issues and things, and we get half the result we would be getting if we trusted in God. I'm convinced that there are things that God has already told us that we should do, but we are too busy working on the things that we should not do. We're already so busy with things that we don't need to do or shouldn't be focused on or so given to that we're missing out on the things that God's already given us to do. How your life might be so much more productive if you trusted God to guide you and lead you and do the things he was calling you to do. Third, when I try to handle things myself, and this is maybe the hardest pill for us to swallow, but in Moses' case, he didn't receive the promised land, and we need to recognize that when I don't do it God's way, I don't receive the promised land. This is the greatest tragedy of the story. Moses had continued to serve God. Moses led the people. Even in God's grace and mercy, though he made his mistakes and made his errors, God continued to allow Moses to do this job, live into this calling. He even continued to allow Moses into his presence, all the way to the promised land, but not into the promised land. Verse 12, God said, Moses, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land that I had given him. Despite his work and effort, despite his sacrifices, despite his spot of leadership, Moses did not get to enter the promised land. And I just wonder how many people will miss out on the kingdom of heaven because they choose not to honor God with their lives and instead decide to live their life seemingly brave, seemingly courageous, but all on their own terms and all in their own way. I thought I'd go back a little ways for some of you. Frank Sinatra sings a song. Maybe I'll step on some toes here. He sings a song about life without regrets. He's at the end of his life, and he talks about living a great life because he did it all by himself. He made it on his own. And he says, for what is a man? What has he got? If not himself, then he has not. To say the things he truly feels, and not the words of one who kneels. Interesting line. Say whatever you feel like saying, whatever's in your heart, whatever thought rattles across your mind. Don't bother worrying about prayer. The record shows I took the blows and I did it my way. Yes, it was my way. That's actually a great anthem, probably. I mean, one of the most popular songs that's ever been. And it probably speaks to a lot of us at a very heart level, because something inside of us wants to say, I was able to do it my way. I wanted to be a stand-up guy. I wanted to be an in-control mom. I wanted to be an I've got it together type person. And it's hard to bend the knee in humility before God. Or it's hard to say, I need guidance in my life. And there's something within us that oftentimes wants to just be able to say, you know what, I did it. It was my way. I proved that I had the moxie. And I could do it. In Moses' case, it cost him the promised land. You know, we're heading to our own promised land. It's not a piece of land like Moses and the Israelites were walking towards. It's a heavenly kingdom. And there are people that will not walk into that promised land because they were not willing to be humble before the Lord, to be given over to God, to be willing to say, I know that I need a Savior. To get off of the self-improvement, I'll do it myself plan of life and say, I need someone to help me. I need someone to rescue me. I need someone to forgive me. Because most of my life I have been the rebel. Most of my life I have lived opposing God. And I need His forgiveness. I need His love and grace. And I want to trust my life only into His hands. I thought maybe we'd... I'll throw a curveball to the worship team, and maybe we could bust out, those are, maybe some have gone outside, but why don't we do your Amazing Grace song over again? And they'll come on back up and help us out, close with a song, and we'll just do a song. And as we go through it, I just challenge you to think about your life, and are you tend to trust more in yourself and think you can do it on your own? Or do you tend to have a desperate need for God and only want His provision and direction and help in your life? Is your heart and your mind open to hear His voice and have His guidance? As we